How do we make and multiply disciples around the block and around the world? With hosts Doug Lucas of Team Expansion, Lee Wood of One Body Church, John Hirima of Big Life, Roger Shull of E3 Partners, and special guests from around the world, we'll explore how believers can come together to make more disciples. Welcome to the More Disciples podcast.
Hello and welcome again to another episode of the More Disciples podcast. I am Roger Shull, one of the co-hosts here, along with Doug Lucas.
Great sweater, Roger.
Yep, got to celebrate. It's still winter, so, got to bring out the winter sweater. It's actually going to be 70 today, but got to have a sweater still. But we also have John Hirima.
Hey, everyone. Great to be here again.
Yeah, and Lee is out sick this week, so we have subbing in for Lee, Guy Caskey, a friend of the show.
Welcome, y'all. How's it going? Great to be able to be here.
Yes, grateful that you are here. And joining us from a much colder place in the United States is Ron Johnson from Denver. He said it's -6 this morning for him, so he's freezing in his basement or wherever he's at. So Guy, why don't you introduce us to Ron? You say you've been getting to know him recently, and just introduce him to us.
Yeah, I'd be glad to. Ron Johnson is in Denver, and he's been planting churches for 33 years. That's crazy, man. That's amazing. And if you know what it means to plant churches, whether it's legacy or multiply movements, it's a lot of work. And so, but also Ron has really been leaning into multiplying disciples, and God's really doing a work in his life, and he has a heart for Denver and beyond. And so we're just really grateful to have him on here today to share his story and us just really talk about how he is multiplying disciples practically in his life and raising up others to do so.
Yeah.
I'm honored to be on, Guy. You mentioned planting churches since I was like a teenager, probably, but the profile of a serial church planter is pretty similar to a serial murderer.
Oh, no.
Oh, really? Okay, this is...
It's a great way to start.
Yeah, we've never started a podcast this way.
Yeah, full disclosure, I have a long record.
The crazy thing is that was the first church planting team I joined was in 1989. So we're both kind of OG dinosaurs.
We're aging ourselves. Back in the days of the Bee Gees.
All right. Well, Ron, why don't you introduce us to yourself? So I like all of our listeners. I actually I've never met you, Ron. So I want to hear your story. Like, how'd you get started church planting? But then what are you pursuing now? You said you kind of are doing like a parallel, like almost traditional church planting type of thing, but also DMM. Like, tell us about how you got into it, but then, how you started doing movement work.
Well, first of all, nice to meet you, Roger, and I do like the sweater. I guess the quick narrative is I grew up religious, came to faith at 16 at a track and field camp, and then didn't really enjoy church a whole lot, but came in contact with a church planter in Chicago. And one night I was on his back porch, and I was kind of helping him out a little bit, and I had a kind of mystical experience with the Holy Spirit. I saw the lights downtown Chicago, and the Spirit said, these lights represent people that Jesus died for, and I want you to live your life planting churches like this guy in urban areas. So that was probably 1987, and then we're going to get into church planting at 89, 90 with a guy named John Wooster out in the Bay Area. So worked with him, planted a church with him, planted another church downtown San Francisco, planted a church in Denver years and years ago called Pathways, multi-site church. And then the last 11 years, I've been pastoring a church called Desperation Church. Been a little building. We recently moved into a bigger building. We've helped start a number of churches since we got started, and kind of stumbled into DMM work this last 24 months.
Ron, I'll just ask, because this is a really relevant and special topic for me. I invest a lot of my time in trying to help local churches be able to embrace this. Can you say something about how you encountered DMM strategy and why you are willing to do it when so many other pastors feel like it's going to distract from the big church experience?
It was a combination of pure desperation meets repentance. So when I was in college ministry, I was discipled by a man named John Brooks, who I owe really so much to. He poured his life into me in kind of a navigator fashion, lots of scripture memory, lots of emphasis on multiplying disciples. And then I drank the church growth Kool-Aid when I planted my own church. I wasn't seeing the kind of multiplication that I wanted to see. And I thought, well, okay, it works for making disciples, but I don't see the multiplication piece. So I'm just going to do church growth. And then during COVID, we kind of had a chance to reflect. Like all churches, we overused the word pivot, but we pivoted and got online and kept the money going. But we're like, okay, now what? And there were two things that led me to begin reading about DMM. One was the level of discipleship. We had 55 small groups, and they were great for caring content and connecting people, shutting the back door. But I couldn't really honestly say they were making disciples, and certainly not disciples who were making disciples. And I began to talk to my friends around the country because we all had a little extra time on our hands, and they're all saying the same thing. And then we've helped plant 46 churches out of our church, mainly parachute guys, but some of our own that we've sent out. And just in the city limits in the last 10 years, we've helped start 6. And I'm going to guesstimate fairly generously that our reach was maybe 5,000 a month with those church plants. And those church plants cost over $10 million. Wow. So the average church plant that we plant, they raise at least 1.5 over 3 years on the front end. And the same amount of time, that 10 years, the city grew by 114,000 people. Yeah. Like, man, we're getting crushed.
Wow. Yes.
So both those kind of realities led me to start reading a lot. And I came across a book by Yin Kai, T for T book. And we just did a beta test. And we started with non-Christians, so a little more of a BBS sort of approach early on. And we started seeing a lot of people come to faith. Everything was on Zoom because we were in lockdown. But in the first year we did it, we saw well over 100 people get baptized through those Discovery Bible studies. We go, man, we're kind of onto something. And then my own neighbors, they like me. Some have been to our church, like, man, not my thing. But I've always known if I invited them over to dinner long enough and started some kind of simple church in my house, I could reach them.
Wow.
So we just kept reading.
That's great.
That's awesome.
That's amazing. Thanks for that, bro. Hey, so tell me, in these last 2 years, what have been some of maybe the habits or things that you've emphasized or things you've stopped and things you've started during this last couple of years that have been, essential to moving forward?
Man, I made some of the same mistakes Lee did. Lee's been very generous with his time. So is Damien. Those two guys, man, they have just been pouring into me. And I've recently come into contact with Curtis Sargent. He also has been very generous with his time. And so like Lee, we just started a bunch of these. We had well over 100 within a year. And then we helped the church in India pivot from being a mega church to DMM. We thought we were doing DMM, but we were just starting lots of them. We've got a lot of apostolic evangelistic personalities on our team. We were just starting a bunch of them. And we thought if we split one in half, we were multiplying. We realized, man, we're not multiplying. It's kind of like multi-site. You're just sort of reproducing.
Yeah.
And so, one of the things we stopped doing was kind of more the DBS model. Not that we won't use that at times, but now we're trying to retrain. We're using Curtis. Curtis is training in Zoom. We're training pastors. We're training over 60 leaders. We had a training last night. We're trying to stabilize the simple churches we have, the 100 we have, and then we're trying to teach them to get healthy, be a spiritual family, and then multiply out of their spiritual family.
This sounds amazing. But I think by most standards, if you look at what you're doing before, it would be considered successful with that kind of growth that you were mentioning earlier. So,
absolutely.
What really triggered you to say, I'm willing to try something totally new? And was it COVID, or was it just, the heartache of not seeing disciples? I mean, because basically you looked successful in the way you were doing it.
Yeah, I think it was just the fruit, the quality of the fruit and the type of fruit.
That's awesome.
God's blessed our ministry here in Denver for the last 20 years. We've seen cool things happen. We had the biggest church downtown for a while. And I look back, man, I go, did anybody who was sitting in the seats actually become a disciple who made disciples? And beyond some staff members, I can't think of anybody. Dude, that's really, really convicting. And then, Denver's an awesome city, man. It's a great place to live. And people live in the Denver dream. And it's, these are the happiest nominal Christians and pagans you'll ever meet in your whole life here in Denver. And, but, I'm just like, I don't want to just create a club that makes them feel like they're Christians. So it was the quality of the fruit, and then just the realization there's no way we're going to reach most of the city through just the churches we know it model. And I'm still big on what DMM people call the legacy model. We just bought a new building, raised, $1.3 million. I'm not stopping that. I actually like that stuff. It's kind of fun. It's just not going to get the job done by itself. And so I'm trying to persuade as many pastors and church planners now to do DMM parallel to their weekend experiences and the programs as I can.
Well, you've certainly convinced me already. I'm all for this. Like, keep up what you're doing, and you can do the DMM parallel. Like, this is great. This is great. But I'm wondering, maybe a little bit more specifics about that happened. Like, you said the general stuff that I love, doing Discovery Bible studies a little bit, but now trying to say like, hey, let's make sure we have good spiritual families with these. You even said simple churches that we're starting and baptizing these people and all these things. But did it start with like you going on stage during your Sunday morning worship? Like, this is what we're doing now? Was it like we got a small core team? Was it like, I'm just going to train the staff? Like you said, you started with non-believers. Does that mean you just started yourself? Like, what did this look like? Maybe more on the granular level, on the micro level.
That's good.
Yeah, that's a great question.
That's real good, Roger.
It started with some staff members reading Yin Kai and me talking a lot about Yin Kai and go, hey, man, they're doing some great stuff in China. And I know we're not in China, but man, why couldn't it happen here? Let's just beta test this and keep it quiet. So we didn't talk about it hardly at all. And we just reached out to friends of ours and started doing 3/3 process with, people, some of whom were Christians and some whom weren't. Some you weren't really sure, kind of unknown. And man, within weeks, we started seeing success. Now, it was aided by the fact that people were so isolated and lonely because of COVID and lockdowns. So people were like, yeah, man, I'll get on a Zoom call for 30 minutes to an hour. So that did really help. But then we started seeing people get baptized and see people like get in the scriptures and sort of bang the scriptures. We go, man, we're kind of onto something. And so we slowly started going public and talking more about it from up front. And then over time, it kind of just evolved. And we go, man, we're a church of simple churches. And we're going to continue to do this with our people, but we're also going to go beyond our people. So right now, of our simple churches, about half of them don't go to restoration, and many of them don't even know about restoration. And we've got a lot of simple churches made up of different ethnic groups now. We've got Nepalis, Indians, Pakistanis, Afghans. And so it's kind of gone way beyond sort of our local demographic.
That's great, Ron. I think as we talk with church leaders in existing churches around the continent, really, both the United States and Canada, one of the themes that seems like keeps coming back at us are some of the practical things. You've been in this for a long time, so it's buildings and budgets and program and staff. And I guess one question that sometimes bubbles up and that kind of lurks out there in the environs, nobody wants to really say it, but how do you deal with offerings? And how have you tackled that? Do these folks in these simple churches, they just give according to when they see a need and you don't worry about it and you still have your inner circle that give to keep the mortgage payment going for the main building? Or do you somehow try to have people give online so it goes toward the mothership? Have you come across that, or is it not a big deal to you?
Well, I've been telling my pastor friends, DMM is not a church growth strategy. Ultimately, I mean, it will grow your church some. We have a young adult ministry that exploded during COVID, and so we are seeing a lot of fruit from the people in simple churches that are younger, but we haven't even tried to get the simple churches to give to the church. We just, if they wander into our building, then they're going to eventually hear about an offering, with this thing called an offering. And our offerings are 80% plus online. So we haven't figured out how to monetize the DMM stuff, and that is even something we're trying to do, right? So
monetize DMM.
Yeah, I've got some friends that did like Chris Galanos, and they blew up their buildings and stuff. Yeah. And man, I admire them, and I prayed hard. Like, God, is that what you want me to do? Yeah. I mean, if that's what you want me to do, I don't want to do it, but I'll do it. And I just never had peace about doing that. And so we still run hard on the weekends. We've just learned how to be very efficient at putting the weekend package together pretty quickly. Like for me, it's about a day and a half investment, and the rest of my time is training leaders. And,
that's great.
Lead my own simple church and being available.
Wow.
That's awesome. Ron, you've shared a little bit. I heard a little bit about the city of Denver. Talk a little bit about how you see Denver being reached, saturated with the gospel, sending and engaging gaps. Tell us a little bit about your heart for your city.
Yeah, I've always had a heart for the city. I'm that weird apostolic personality. I don't cry about hardly anything. I had a communication coach say, man, you need to share your feelings more in your messages. I'm like, let's see, I know about mad and glad. There might be a sad. I need one of those emotion wheels, and I got to expand my repertoire. But there's one thing I don't know, and this is just a Holy Spirit thing. I always get emotional about lost people. And it happened like in an instant when God called me. That's just something that's been in my heart. So, man, I've always had a burden for our city, but just not had a lot of success, And, our churches that we planted, I mean, they're successful and they're reaching thousands because we got a lot of them in the burbs. But, man, we're not even close to keeping up with population growth. And so when Curtis trained us and he talked about how God used him on Henan Island, if I'm saying it right, how there are all these districts, and one district at a time, God raised up a person of peace. Curtis trained that person of peace. And, within whatever it was, 5 years, I had over 1 million people in simple churches. And then way beyond that, after he left, I go, man, as I was watching him talk about that, it really hit me. And so I've got these maps on my wall right here. The top one is the counties. The bottom one is the neighborhoods in the city. And I got a global map too. But man, I pray over those counties and those neighborhoods almost daily. And I'll have to say the vision. I'd love to see a simple church in every neighborhood that has DMM DNA in it. And the same thing for every county in Colorado. And then, Guy, you and I have talked about the region. I got on the 2414 map and I go, I pretty much live in like the most vacuous region for DMM.
Yes.
And I joked with her. I did a vision night recently. I go, man, wouldn't it be cool if we had a DMM growing in every major city in the Rocky Mountain region? That's pretty easy because there's only like one major city in the whole region. That's a pretty attainable goal, I think. So, man, that's my heart. I wake up and I pray over that. It's too big for me, and I've learned a lot from you guys about unity. And Lee he hardly can open his mouth without John 17:23 coming out.
Seriously,
So I'm going after pastors of peace now, and just trying to get as many guys, exposed as I can, and train all I can, and hope that a few that are faithful rise up and we start seeing some real growth.
That's awesome. Hey, Ron, speaking of unity, when you decided to start moving into a new direction there, did you get pushback from staff or members, and how did you power through that if you did?
Yeah, I'm really blessed. I've always had staff that love lost people, want to make disciples. We just didn't have the right methods. So I'm really blessed right now. I can be the biological father of everyone on my team. It's kind of scary. But I've got young, smart, very hardworking, passionate disciple-making staff members, and man, they live and breathe this stuff. And last night we had snow, so we had to do our training on Zoom. But they've just raised up lots of young people, and movements are led by young people. So I'm just blessed with the team I have. The asterisk with us is the reason we've seen so much fruit. I think is in part, at least this initial round of fruit, the Gen 1, is because our staff's so passionate and apostolic by nature.
So with that staff, you mentioned already, like you're right now ongoing training like you did last night, and even saying like almost needing to settle, like the stage you're at is like needing to settle with the groups you started, with the simple churches you started to really form spiritual families. Like what has that ongoing training with the staff or with anyone else involved look like? And even I'm wondering, like, why did you say that you guys are trying to settle right now instead of just going and starting more and more? Like there's kind of two different questions. What's ongoing training look like, and why is that where you guys are at right now?
We did Metacamp with Curtis. And I'll tell you how I met Curtis. It's kind of funny. We didn't know what to call these. We were calling him like Ralph Moore is a friend of mine. I don't know if you've ever heard of him, but Ralph has one of the most successful multiplying churches, I think, in the last 50 years. And I asked him, I said, hey, we want to raise up our own church planters. We've only raised up a few, mainly done parachutes. And he said, what you got to do is start calling your small groups churches. That actually was the first conversation before I read Rinky and Kai.
Wow.
And he said back in 1971, we started calling our churches mini churches. His mini skirts, minivans, that kind of thing. So we're like, okay, Ralph.
And then you wanted to go mini, M-A-N-Y.
Yeah. And Ralph even told me, he wrote a book recently on microchurch, and he said, hey, if I could do it all again, I would sell cars, and I would just in a microchurch. You go, man, that's pretty powerful given the impact he's had. And so we're sitting in a room one day, and we go, what do we call these things? And my worship leader says, but they're really simple. Like anybody can lead one. You just follow the play. 3/3 is easy. Why don't you just call them simple churches? So we Googled that, thinking, all right, we're going to trademark this thing. This is ours.
No,
and I come across this website called Sume. And I'm like, who are these posers, man? These probably seminary students. They have no idea what they're doing, but okay, I guess they're ahead of us. So whatever, we'll call them simple churches. And then in God's sovereignty and providence, there was a friend of mine in like a halftime type group, Success and Significance, that met Chris Wynn, and he says, you got to meet this guy. And so we have a meeting at a coffee shop, and I'm even late. I'm like, I don't really want to meet this guy, but all right, since he's my friend, I'll go meet him. Within 5 minutes, we were like, we're going to be brothers forever.
Wow.
When I heard about what he did and what was behind the scenes, and man, we have 2 engineers who are trying to put our CRM system together. They never cry. They're athletes, engineers. They both were crying when they met Chris. When he said, hey, I got a free CRM system for you. It's called Discipleship Tools. Anyway, we met Curtis through him, and Curtis's training is what made us settle down. And Lee's testimony, they both said, hey, bro, you keep doing this thing. You may get to 200 simple churches plus, but they're going to start fading on you. And we've already seen that. And so, man, we want fruit that lasts. And so we're slowing down, which is really hard for hyper apostles, this type of personalities to do. But we're just trusting we do that, and we're faithful with obedience, and the faithful leaders, we're eventually going to hopefully J-curve in the future.
As you have made this journey, Ron, what has this meant to you personally? How has your life changed from being mega pastor Ron to trainer Ron? What's been the change inside of you?
It's made me a better disciple.
Wow.
You know, the most powerful thing about Metacamp for us wasn't the tools and the concepts, but it was Curtis. Man, the guy can hardly say the word Jesus without crying. He's so in love with it and so surrendered. And every one of us walked away going, hey, those tools were kind of cool, but we could have gone through the training and got those. It was Curtis's impact on us. And we're like, we all want to be like Curtis. Yeah. So, man, even before I met Curtis, it was forcing me to my knees more because, you can't make this stuff happen. Yep. And so my prayer life it's intensified. The volume of prayers increased.
Wow.
I go, man, if I'm going to teach people to obey, I got to just constantly be going, God, what is your will?
Wow.
So it's just helped me become a better lover of Jesus, I think.
That's so great.
That's an amazing testimony right there. Hey, Ron, obviously there's probably a lot of other folks that are in your position, but right now that, they think that there's more, they're not seeing the type of fruit that they want to see. What encouragement would you give them if they're listening?
Yeah, I think if you're discontent, that it's probably a holy discontent to at least explore this. You read about it, pray about it. I would not advise anybody to go like wholesale DMM and tell your church one weekend after reading Curtis's books or going through the Zoom training, hey, we're going to do this. I would just say do a little probe, do a beta test and start one yourself and see if you can get to multiply, see what happens to you and just test it out.
That's great.
I mean, you guys have helped more churches that go parallel to me. Any advice you'd have on that?
Well, I think that's actually something that I personally, I was hoping to have advice from you because I actually struggle with that personally. Like my story is I came to Christ kind of with people pursuing disciple making and church planting movements. So like I kind of never was super a part of like a traditional church. So I think that, I don't know if it did, but for some reason I struggle with the desire to see the body of Christ mobilized towards these things and wanting to talk to pastors about how, just about this stuff and just saying, hey, this is something like I'm not trying to sell anything. I'm just trying to like tell you some stuff I've learned. But I feel like I'm at a disadvantage in some way of trying to vision cast to pastors and knowing what to say. And it's something where you're coming from being a pastor and you're talking to other pastors. So I'm just wondering, like, what do you or what would you say to other pastors who maybe start to have that discontentment, maybe think like, man, I read this book, I want to start something, like what, or maybe they're not even in that place. Like, what would you vision cast to a pastor about the importance of doing this?
So I had 20 pastors in our chapel 4 weeks ago. So I can just say what I told them. I start by saying, hey, this is a new thing for me. Like, I am no expert. I barely know, a thimbleful of tools and concepts regarding DMM. There's a lot of people who know a lot more than I do. But I just share like what's happened to me personally and the fruit we've had. And, it's always a dangerous thing when you throw out numbers, right? Because you can have numbers and have really bad fruit. When you come out of the attractional world, the legacy world, we've got certain metrics that ring our bell, right? And right, wrong, or indifferent. When you start talking about baptisms and stuff like that, people go, I didn't have that many baptisms. I'm listening. So I think maybe one of the reasons God blesses us with fruit is so I can share that. People go, well, I'm not seeing that. I'll give that a try. But it might be a little dangerous to do it that way. I'm not saying everybody should do it that way. But what had happened is 10 of those pastors said, man, I'll give it a try. So I'm training 10 of the pastors right now. We meet weekly. And I tell them, watch all the Zoom stuff for that session. Then we use Curtis's discussion questions. And I'm just titrating them very slowly towards, whatever the Holy Spirit's leading them to do.
Wow.
Here's what I heard you say in this, and I'm in a similar role in a sense, being at a mega church that I have the responsibility of movements in our city. I heard you say that we're losing ground, that there's no way that we can plant enough mega churches to keep up with even the population growth. And then financially, you said there's limits on that and how much it costs financially. And I've heard you say some things that I think that are pretty important. And that's one of the things we said. We're never going to get the job done of seeing the gospel saturated in Houston without us really working together, connecting, communicating, and collaborating. And it's going to take all of us. And I mean, I heard you say those same things, and those are the kind of things we've been casting vision for out of Woods Edge. So we're losing ground. You know, we used to have one out of 1,400, one church for every 1,400 people. And I'm not talking about Christ-centered gospeling churches. I'm just talking about a facility. Now it's one out of 1,500. I mean, we are just losing ground constantly. And then the issue of baptism, of how much it costs, like $1.4 million to baptize one person. That's atrocious. I mean, I had a simple church here in Houston that 12 of us in a year baptized 24. Everyone in that church baptized someone. And we had 24 baptisms by all 12 adult members. And imagine if you had that type of number out of your legacy churches. Well, you're probably not going to get it. That's why we need all of us together. So I heard you say all those things.
Yeah,
That's
I've used
fantastic.
that 1415, where the $1 million per member, that wakes people up. But, you know, we're a very post-Christian city, and getting a building is a nightmare. Like when I was back here in the 90s, you know, I could find buildings. I could force myself into buildings. But I mean, I spent 11 years trying to went from 177 seats to 300. And it took me 11 years and a whole lot of door knocking to find that. And so people realize, man, it's too expensive. We're not going to find enough buildings. We're getting shut out of schools because of certain issues, COVID notwithstanding. And so it's pretty easy to stir up discontent with the status quo. But then you also, I think, have to tell legacy church pastors, hey, what you're doing is not bad. You know, I tell people in the room, I go, hey, I love my legacy church, man. I love my people. I love getting together on Sunday mornings. I love lights and hazers and all that stuff, you know, because a lot of, especially the megachurch pastors who've been in conferences, you know, for years, the churches we know crowd and the house church crowd would butt heads. Yes, and, you know, the legacy guys go, you don't have stats, you don't have fruit. That only happens in third world countries. And then the house church guys would say, you're not making disciples, and all you care about is the next building. And man, I don't want to be part of that at all. I want to say, way to go, both sides of this. And you can do it together, and you can still enjoy the weekend and not be ashamed of it. I love it.
Thanks for that. I think that's super important. John Harrington, who's probably planted more churches here in Texas than anyone, he and I worked very closely together, and he was one of the keys has been me. He said, man, I felt like before that anybody that was into movements or simple church treated me like I was an unholy leper, and you treated me like a brother, you know? And so as a result, we're working together for our city and for the nations. And I don't want to tear anything down or don't want to be against. I want to be for. And I've actually led some unhealthy house churches that they were gathering because they were against some kind of system. And I'm like, we need to be for Jesus and for the mission and movement, not against stuff. So I really appreciate that.
Yeah,
Ron.
I appreciate Mission John. We just launched 2 weeks ago out of our church basement, the Denver Church Planting Network. I'm not leading it. Jim Candy with Stadia is going to be leading it. Great guy. And we've learned a lot from John and appreciate that model. So I'm trying to symbolically, with my involvement, say, hey, I'm still on the legacy side, but I'm also going hard after DMM. And we're trying to plant 5 legacy churches a year, but I'm probably spending 65 to 70% of my time on the DMM side right now.
Wow. Ron, would you just tell us one story about a changed life? I know we've been talking about 60,000 foot level, but can you bring this down? And I don't want to put you on the spot. We didn't get to talk about this before we started the broadcast, but can you think of one person's life that was maybe affected or impacted through a DMM approach, and maybe tell that story?
Yeah, there's so many, but the one that's most personal to me is my good friend, Jim Kreitman. So his wife, Debbie, participated in a simple church led by Joe Cockman, a good friend of mine. And then she came back to a deeper place of faith. I think she'd been a follower in years past, but got baptized and went all in with Jesus, and then introduced her husband to our church, the video experience. And then he and I became friends, and I had the pleasure of sharing the gospel with him, and he received Christ. And he's very entrepreneurial, and so he currently leads 2 simple churches that he started with kind of a mix of Christians and non-Christians. And then per Curtis's advice, we were starting all these and then leaving. We've got a simple church that now meets in our home and other homes in our neighborhood. And so he and his wife, Debbie, in our simple church, as well as other neighbors. Wow. So I love that story. It's nice when your friends come out of the DMM movement and that stuff. It's like, really cool. So it's very integrated in our lives right now.
It's very cool.
It's awesome.
Awesome. So, Ron, what do you think this looks like? If you could look into the future, 2 years from now, 4 years from now.
Yeah, when we did our vision night, I've kind of given up on casting vision because every time I do it, I'm wrong. I had a huge multi-site vision. It kind of all blew up, and then had a vision for 2 years ago, and then COVID blew it up. So I just tell people now, wouldn't it be cool? That's all I say. And so 2 or 3 years from now, wouldn't it be cool if at least half of our neighborhoods in the city had a simple church, and if half of our counties had a simple church that had the right DNA, at least the possibility for saturating that neighborhood or that county? Wouldn't that be cool? So, man, I wake up praying about that every day, and maybe it could happen faster. Curtis challenged me to take dreams and accelerate them. Go, what would it take to make that happen even faster? But, I'm trying to be somewhat realistic. I think that could happen in 2 or 3 years. And so that's what I'm praying for every single day.
That's fantastic.
That's great.
And then we've got things open up. We're going to go to India. We're seeing some really cool stuff happen over there in Delhi. A friend of mine, Jay Tinder Singh, who's just been amazing with Simple Church and DMM work. And he had a church of 8,000 in India, moved to the States, and because of persecution, he began to pivot them over the last 3 years. And so they have 200 Simple Churches. They are multiplying over there.
Wow. Cool
stuff's happening. So wouldn't it be cool? We saw a movement, like some of the movements you hear about in India, Victor John and others. It would be cool if we could see a movement that reach millions eventually.
That would be very cool.
Yeah, well, I think I like what you said about vision casting, where it's like you're casting vision, but it never actually happens. So it wouldn't be cool. I like that. But, we know God's vision and heart is to reach every tongue, tribe, and nation with the gospel. So we can vision cast that because God said it. So we know it's going to happen.
That's right.
I am curious about that piece, like with here and there in India, do the same thing. Like, has that been part of what you guys have been seeing, like doing DMM stuff in the United States? Like some of the people from your church, or just even other people can come to learn about that for the sake of learning to implement it overseas? Like, is that what you're kind of communicating, or is that something you've thought towards at all?
We're starting to. We've always had work in Calcutta. In fact, right before COVID hit, I just had come back from Calcutta. We've had great luck with starting schools, but we didn't have any luck with multiplying house churches, which we've always had 7 house churches. And for some reason, it's been a struggle there. But there's a guy on our team named Chandra. He's from India. So he's, I think it's very relational for us. We kind of go where the relationships are. So that's why we're focusing now on Delhi. And then he has a woman in Bihar that now has 15 simple churches in her movement. She actually is, I think, a Gen 3, Gen 4 possibly. We're loading all of his simple churches into our CRM system so we can start tracking that. He's got some more in Kathmandu. But it's all been relational. Jay has reached a lot of different people groups here in Denver, and then they'll grow as disciples. They'll move to a city somewhere in the country, evangelize their friends, and then start a simple church. And we've been seeing that happen pretty regularly. So we're just kind of following where's God blessing. He's been blessing us locally with Afghans, Pakistanis, and Indians. And so we're just kind of riding Jay's coattails really on that stuff.
I love this, Ron, how matter of fact it is with you. I mean, you don't sound like you're trying to sell us something. You don't sound like you're trying to convince anybody of anything. You're just like one beggar sharing with another beggar where you found bread. And I love that. But
that's funny. I'm talking about duckling discipleship, my message this week. And that's D.T. Niles, I think, said that. I'm going to quoting him this week. So, man, you're ahead of me.
But the highlight of the whole thing for me is Roger's sweater. I got to say, that's just the highlight.
See, that's my highlight for sure today.
For sure.
Yeah. A plug for everyone to go check out the More Disciples YouTube channel, right? I'll wear next week. I'll wear my top hat. It'll be great.
Oh, yeah. Hey, Roger, by the way, we're going to do a thing called Multiply Us, and we're finding guys like Ron all over the country, all over the continent, and we do it once a quarter, and they can go to multiplyus.com. It's actually a menu header here at More Disciples, and we're doing it out of that in partnership with 2414. Ron, I'm going to be in contact with you and see if you can be on one of these quarterly communities of practice once a quarter, and we get people together on Zoom and then break out groups. It's really fun. So just thought I'd mention that.
I'd love to. I'd love to run with you guys, and
thanks.
Thank you for going ahead of us and plowing the field. And so you guys can come along and ride your coattails and learn from you. So thank you.
Well, thank you. I think it's about a good time to wrap up. I just want to summarize some things that I remember. Well, actually, I want to say this. I was at a training just this past weekend. It was great in Raleigh-Durham. We call it a mid-level training. It's basically just gathering leaders who have already been implementing these principles. Some purely like CPM, like Simple Church starting. That's my church. Some were a hybrid. like you're describing, or maybe the parallel model of having the Sunday worship gathering, traditional in that sense, but then having the simple churches throughout the week. And there was a question during that where basically said, like, where we were trying to talk about church identity and why it was important. And one guy spoke up and was like, I just am imagining pastors saying, like, well, if you're doing this, like, you're trying to blow up the church, like you're trying to do something like anti-church. And I think what you said, which is something that maybe I try to communicate, or we try to come to the conclusion of, that this stuff is not in competition. We are, like you said, you're even running parallel. Like, we're trying to work together. We're trying to collaborate. Maybe that's out there, that's unhealthy, but that's not what we want to be about. We want to be one, like Jesus said. Right. And so how can someone like me, who is going purely like simple church starting, that's my Sunday gathering, also partner together and collaborate together with people like you and like Guy and like others who are running that parallel track, where it's like we got a lot of the trappings of traditional church, but also the parallel simple church is multiplying. And I love that vision. And I heard you say, like, it starts with just a desperate longing to see lost people come to know the Lord, a heart for Jesus, a lot of prayer, just a vision in line with God's vision in that regard. But also you said, just start with a few. Like, you start with your staff. That's who was really on board, but just start with a few. Don't try to blow up the whole church. I mean, unless that's what God's leading you to do. We mentioned Chris Galanos. But if God's really leading you to do that, but you said, hey, why don't you just start with a few and just start running that track and just start training them on simple tools and really try to implement yourself. Like, you personally have a simple church in your home as well. And then just try to take steps from there. And if somebody's listening to this, wanting to introduce this to their church or their small group or whatever, I loved how you said titrating it in, just going slowly, drip the vision, maybe say, hey, why don't you read this book? Why don't we talk about this one concept? Let's slowly get there and see how people respond. And if they receive it, keep on going with the few who really want to commit. And then after you go wide, don't just stay wide, but go deep. That's what you're working on right now. So I love that.
Love it.
Yeah, so if anybody wants to get in touch with us, or we can connect you with Ron too, go to moredisciples.com. We can do that. We can make that happen. So thank you so much, Ron, for being on today. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Appreciate it, Ron.
Appreciate it. Thanks, Ron.
Thanks for your work.
How are you making more disciples? What problems have you encountered? What successes have you celebrated? What questions do you have? Share your stories with us by visiting moredisciples.com/contact. If you're looking for next steps on growing your ability to make and multiply disciples, visit moredisciples.com to find resources, tools, and events all designed to help you make more disciples.